The stone came through the window a little after dawn, and Lin Aling was already awake to hear it. She had learned, in her 2 winters in Coldwater, to sleep the way a rabbit sleeps, one ear turned to the street. So when the glass burst inward across the counter of her father's herb shop, and the cold morning air came pouring in behind it, she did not scream. She only rose from the pallet behind the medicine drawers, pressed one hand flat against the wall to steady the tremble in her knees, and reached up without thinking to touch the jade pendant that hung at her throat. It was the last warm thing her mother had given her at the harbor in Guangdong, a small carved fish the color of river water, and her thumb found the smooth of it the way a person finds a prayer. The stone had a paper tied to it with butcher's string. She did not need to read English well to know it was ugly. She had seen the same rough letters on the handbills that a man had been pasting to the boardwalk posts all week. The ones with the drawing of a slit-eyed devil and the word that the children shouted at her back when she carried her baskets to the creek. She knelt among the broken glass in her thin cotton shoes and picked the paper loose and held it, and outside in the blue half-light, she heard boots go quick and guilty down the alley behind Ma Wing's laundry. Whoever had thrown it had not stayed to watch her weep. That, at least, was a small mercy. She would not have given them the pleasure. Coldwater was a silver town clinging to a dry brown fold of the Nevada hills, a single crooked main street of false-fronted saloons, and a bank and a newspaper office, with the great black scar of the Consolidated mine chewing at the ridge above it. Down at the low end, where the wind carried the tannery stink and the good people did not care to walk, sat the dozen lantern-lit shacks that the town called Chinatown as if it were a joke. There were 40 souls there, most of them men who had come to lay the rails or dig the drift and had been left behind when the work moved on. And there was Aling, 22 years old, the only Chinese woman in the county, keeper of a shop that smelled of dried tangerine peel and ginseng, and 10,000 miles of longing. And the loneliest thing about her was not the men who hated her. It was that there was no one, in all that hard country, whose hand she might have held. She swept up the glass before the sun was full, because a swept floor was a kind of dignity, and dignity was the only wealth her father had left her. Old Lin had crossed the ocean first, years before, a village herbalist who dreamed of Gold Mountain and found instead a lifetime of other men's laundry and a cough that finally took him in the wet spring 2 years gone. She had come to nurse him and had arrived to bury him, and rather than crawl home shamed she had stayed and kept his shop, brewing the same bitter teas that had eased the miner's aching lungs, and the whore's monthly pains, and the banker's wife's sleeplessness, none of which any of them would admit to buying in daylight. She was tolerated the way a useful animal is tolerated. She had learned to live inside that narrow room and be grateful for it. But this morning, kneeling in the glass, she felt the room narrowing further, felt the whole town leaning its weight against her one thin door, and she did not yet know why the hate had sharpened overnight into a thrown stone. She found out at noon, when Sheriff Cole Whitaker ducked his head under her lintel and stood filling her doorway with the dust and the daylight behind him. He was a big, weathered man of perhaps 35, with a sun-cracked jaw and pale eyes that had seen too much and forgiven little of it, and a tin star worn dull on a coat gone gray with age. She had spoken to him exactly 4 times in 2 years, each time about some drunk who needed hauling out of the alley, and each time he had touched his hat brim to her, which no other white man in Coldwater had ever once done. She did not trust it. A courtesy could be a trap. She stood very straight behind her counter with her hands folded into her sleeves and waited for him to accuse her of something. "Tom Falk is dead," he said. His voice was low and even, a voice that did not waste itself. "Died in the night, up at the Consolidated bunkhouse, twisting like a poisoned dog. And there's men in the saloon saying you sold him the medicine that did it." The floor seemed to tilt under her. Tom Falk, a big slow miner with a cough like a rock slide, who had come to her 3 days back, shamefaced, wanting something for the blood he was spitting. She had given him loquat syrup and a paper twist of fritillaria, and told him in her careful English to stop the tunnel work or it would kill him. She had told him. She said this now, the words coming out too fast and too foreign, and she saw the sheriff's eyes move over her face the way a man reads weather, looking for the lie. He did not find it. She watched him not find it, and something in his hard face shifted, some tiredness that was almost like grief. But behind him the street was filling. She could hear it, the low gathering murmur of men with nothing to do and someone new to blame, the sound she had heard once before in a burning village a world away, and her hand rose again to the jade fish at her throat. "Stay inside," Cole Whitaker said quietly. "Bar the door. Don't open it for anybody but me." And then he was gone, back into the light, and she stood alone in the smell of her father's medicines, wondering why a man sworn to that town would tell its only Chinese woman to keep her door shut against it. She barred the door. She sat in the dark behind the ginseng drawers with her father's cleaver across her knees and listened to cold water turn against her by inches. All that long afternoon, the murmur outside rose and fell like a tide that could not decide to come in. She heard the name Falk shouted and the word poison, and other words, worse ones, and under all of it a single voice she began to recognize. A smooth, carrying, educated voice that did not shout, but that the shouting seemed to organize itself around. It belonged, she would learn, to Ambrose Doyle, who owned the Consolidated Mine and the Coldwater Clarion newspaper both. A soft-handed man in a brocade vest, who had never in his life swung a pick, but who spoke at the top of the boardwalk steps, as though grief for poor Tom Falk were breaking his generous heart. She could not see him. She only heard how the crowd went quiet to let him speak, and loud again when he finished, and she understood, with the cold, clear knowing of a hunted thing, that the stone through her window that morning had not been the beginning of anything. It had been a test. Someone had wanted to see whether Coldwater would let it happen. Near dusk, the boards of her porch creaked and she gripped the cleaver. But it was only Uncle Fong, the old herbalist from 3 doors down who had been her father's friend across 40 years and 2 continents. He had come through the back, bent and quick, his long gray queue tucked into his collar, and when she let him in, he took her cold hands in his papery ones and would not let go. "They are saying it in the street as though it is already decided," he told her in the soft, rushing Cantonese of home, the words like a warm cloth on a wound. "Little Ling, you must go tonight. Down the wash to the rail spur. The Sacramento men will hide you. This town wants a body to hang for Falk, and there is no body here but yours. And you, Uncle?" And a sing. The boy, she meant, the orphan of 9 years who slept in Fong's back room and carried water for the whole of Chinatown and called her elder sister. "If I run, they will only turn on all of you. They will burn the whole low end and call it justice." She had seen that too, in the village, in the year the soldiers came. She knew how a mob, denied its first throat, went looking for the next. "I did not poison that man. I will not run from the truth like a thief." Old Fong looked at her a long moment with wet eyes and did not argue, because he had known her father and he knew where the girl's stubbornness came from. He only reached into his sleeve and pressed something into her palm and folded her fingers over it. It was her father's mortar and pestle chop, the little soapstone seal old Lin had used to stamp every packet of medicine he ever sold in this country, his name and his honest trade cut into the stone. "Then keep this close," the old man said, "so that if they will not hear your voice, the stone can still speak your father's name." And he slipped back out into the dark, and she was alone again. And outside the murmur had become a chant she could feel in the soles of her feet. They came for her with torches on the 3rd night. And by then Cole Whitaker had already begun, quietly, to unmake the lie. She did not know that yet. She knew only the 2 days between. 2 days in which the sheriff had come each morning and each evening to stand a while on her broken porch, not entering, not speaking much, only being seen there, his long shadow lying across her door like a drawn line. No one in that town had quite the nerve to cross in daylight. She had watched him from behind the shutter. She had watched the way men's eyes slid off him and the way the smooth-voiced Doyle smiled at him without warmth. She had brought him tea once, out to the porch, in her father's chipped cup, not knowing how else to say the thing she could not say. And he had held the cup in his big scarred hand and looked at the pale liquor a moment as if it were something he had been thirsty for his whole life and had never once been offered. He had drunk it slowly. He had said, looking out at the ugly street and not at her, "My mother used to keep a garden, before the camps, mint and such. This tastes like something that comes from a place where a person planted things on purpose." It was the most she had ever heard him say, and it was, she understood, a door left the smallest crack ajar. She had eased it open a hand's breadth. She had asked him quietly why he stood there, why a sheriff of Coldwater guarded a woman his whole town wanted dead. For a long while, she thought he would not answer. His jaw worked under the day's gray stubble. Then he said, still not looking at her, in a voice scraped down to the raw grain, "When I was 17, up at a camp called Rough and Ready, a Chinese man named Wang was hauled out of his tent for a killing he never did. The real killer confessed it 8 years later, dying of the pox, laughing about it. Wang was hung from a windlass beam over the sluice while 40 men watched. He turned the empty cup in his fingers. My father held the rope, and I stood in that crowd, 17 years old, and I did not say one word, not one." The pale eyes came to her then, and there was no self-pity in them, only a debt an entire life had not paid down. "I have been a lawman 20 years, ma'am, and I have kept exactly one promise the whole time. I will not stand in another crowd and hold my tongue, not ever again." She had not been able to speak. She had only reached out, before she knew she meant to, and rested her small hand on the back of his where it gripped the cup, a thing so far outside the law of that town that both of them stopped breathing, and his hand had gone very still under hers, and neither of them had moved for the space of 3 heartbeats, and then a wagon had rattled past on the street and they had come apart like guilty things. But the warmth of it stayed on her skin long after. She lay awake that night not thinking of the mob at all. She thought of a boy of 17 in a crowd, learning the exact weight of his own silence, and of the man that boy had spent 20 hard years becoming, and she was afraid, not of Coldwater now, but of the softness opening in her own chest like a bruise that did not hurt. On the 3rd night, the softness and the terror arrived together. She smelled the pitch smoke first, through the broken window she had stuffed with rags, and then she heard them coming down the hill from the Consolidated with that same tidal roar, but louder now, unbanked. 40 or 50 men liquored up on Doyle's free whiskey and Doyle's careful grief, their torches making a moving orange wound in the dark. Down the low-end doors were barring and lanterns going out. She heard Uncle Fong's voice somewhere, calling the men of Chinatown to arm with what they had, hoe handles and cleavers, and one ancient fowling piece, 40 frightened souls against the weight of a whole town's hate, and she knew with a sick certainty that if she stayed behind her door, they would burn every shack in the low end to get at her. So she did the one thing no one expected. She unbarred her door, and she stepped out onto her own broken porch, alone, into the torchlight, in her father's shop with her mother's jade at her throat, and her father's soapstone chop closed in her fist, and she stood where they could all see her and did not run. The roar faltered. A mob wants a cornered thing, a thing that flees and can be chased. It does not know, for a moment, what to do with a small woman standing straight in the light with her chin up. In that hanging moment, she looked out over the sea of red faces and torch fire, and saw the drawing of the slit-eyed devil on the handbills nailed to every post, and she saw, up on the boardwalk steps in his brocade vest, untouched by the smoke, the soft, smiling face of Ambrose Doyle, and she understood at last, wholly, that this had never once been about poor dead Tom Falk. Then a big gray-coated figure came down off the steps and put himself between her and all of them. Cole Whitaker did not draw his gun. That was the thing she would carry to her own grave, that he stood on the bottom step of her porch with his back to her and his empty hands loose at his sides, and faced 50 armed men with nothing but the dull tin star on his chest. And when he spoke, his voice was not loud, so that the mob had to quiet itself to hear him. And in quieting, began already to be a little less a mob and a little more a crowd of tired men in the cold. Tom Falk, he said, was not poisoned by any medicine. He let it sit. Someone near the front cursed him. He did not hurry. I sent Falk's water jug and his stomach to Doc Merrifield down in Carson on Tuesday's stage, Cole said. The doc wired me back this afternoon. Arsenic. Not the herb kind that eases a cough. The white kind, ratsbane. The kind a man buys by the tin at Doyle's own mercantile. His pale eyes moved slowly across the front rank of faces. And Tom Falk, before he died twisting, told the bunkhouse cook one thing over and over. He said he'd seen the Consolidated survey stakes moved in the night. He said Ambrose Doyle was jumping the claims on the low end, the whole of Chinatown, because there's a silver ledge running clean under those shacks, and it's worth more than this whole town above ground. Cole's voice never rose, and that was why they heard every word. Falk was going to talk, so Falk got a bellyful of ratsbane, and the man who fed it to him needed you all looking down here at a laundrywoman instead of up at his own hands. For one whole breath, Coldwater was silent enough to hear the torches hiss. Ah Ling stood behind the sheriff's broad back and watched the crowd's face change. watched the hate curdle into something more dangerous to Ambrose Doyle than any weapon, which was doubt, and she watched Doyle stop smiling. "He's a China-loving liar," Doyle said from the steps, and his smooth voice cracked at the edges now. "Where's your proof, Whitaker? A wire from a drunk doctor? He'll say anything the sheriff pays him to say. Are you going to take the word of a foreigner's whore over honest white men?" The ugly word went through the crowd like a hook, meaning to snag them back. And it very nearly did. She felt the mob's mind teeter. She felt 50 men decide, in the space of a heartbeat, that it was easier to burn a small brown woman than to believe they had been played for fools by the man who owned their wages. It was Cole who broke it, and he broke it not with the doctor's wire but with a name. "Deputy Bracken," the sheriff said, without turning, and a big man in the front rank went suddenly still. "Rufway Bracken, who takes Doyle's money on the side and thinks I don't know it. Rufway, you were on the door of the Consolidated Mercantile the night Falk died. You want to tell these men who came out of Doyle's private storeroom at midnight with a tin under his coat, or do you want to hang for it alongside him when the marshal comes up from Carson on Thursday's stage, which he is, because I wired him too?" The man Bracken looked at Doyle. Doyle looked at Bracken, and in that one glance, the flick of the master's eyes ordering the dog to lie for him, and the dog's dawning understanding that the master would let him swing alone, the whole rotten scheme came apart in the torchlight for every man there to see. Bracken did not confess. He did something worse for Doyle. He took one step back, away from him, into the anonymous safety of the crowd, and that single step was louder than any shouting. The torches began, one by one, to lower. Ambrose Doyle saw his mob dissolving, and did the thing that men like him always do when the tool breaks in their hand. He reached under his fine brocade vest and drew a pocket pistol, small and silver and quick, and he aimed it not at the sheriff who had ruined him, but past him, at the small straight woman on the porch, because she was still, to the last, the thing he needed dead. She saw the little black eye of the barrel find her. She had time to close her fingers hard around her father's soapstone chop and think, absurdly, of her mother on the harbor wall, growing small and smaller as the ship pulled out. Cole Whitaker moved faster than a big man had any right to. He did not draw and fire. There was no time, and a shot into a torchlit crowd would have killed 3 others. He simply turned and stepped fully into the space in front of her, all of him, his broad back filling her whole world, and the little pistol cracked, and she felt him take the ball as a great shudder that went through his frame, and into hers where her hands had flown up against his spine. He did not fall. He reached back with one arm and closed it around her to keep her upright. Or himself, she never afterward knew which. And with his other hand he drew at last, in one smooth, scarred motion, and fired once over the heads of the crowd, and Ambrose Doyle's silver pistol spun away into the dust with 2 of his fingers, and the man went down screaming among the boots of the very mob he had built. Then it was over, the way a storm is over. Not cleanly, but all at once, the pressure simply gone out of the air. Men were shouting, but it was ordinary shouting now, the shouting of frightened, decent people, realizing what they had almost done. Someone was stamping out a dropped torch. Somebody had Doyle by the collar. And Cole Whitaker turned slow inside the circle of her hands, his gray coat going dark and wet under her palms, and looked down at her with those pale eyes gone soft at last, and said, "You were supposed to stay inside." And then his knees went, and she took his whole falling weight against her small body, and would not let him touch the ground. He did not die, though for 2 days and 2 nights she was not sure of it, and neither, she thought, was he. They had carried him to her shop because it was nearest and because, in the strange remade order of that night, no one thought to object. She had cut the ball out herself, above the hip where it had lodged against the bone, with Uncle Fong holding the lamp and steadying her wrist, and Ah Sing sent running for clean cloth and boiled water, and she had packed the wound with the yarrow and the frankincense and the powdered sanchi that stops the deep bleeding, the knowledge in her hands older than the town outside, older than the country, come across the ocean in her father's tin trunk. Doc Merrifield, when he arrived up from Carson 2 days later with the marshal, looked at her stitching and her poultice and the clean pink edges of the healing wound, and said he could not have done it better, and, being an honest man, said it out loud in the street where people heard. And people had begun, in those 2 days, to come to her door. Not many, but some. The bunkhouse cook, hat in his hands, to say he was sorry, that he had heard poor Tom Falk say it too, and had been too afraid to speak. The widow Abernathy from the boarding house, with an armful of clean linen for the sheriff, and a hard, shy nod for Ah Ling that was its own kind of apology. A miner's wife with a sick child, come at last in the honest daylight, no longer caring who saw her go to the China woman's door. Coldwater did not become good overnight. Towns do not. But something in it had been shown its own face in the torchlight, and had not been able to look away. And shame, she was learning, could be a beginning as surely as love could. She sat with him through the worst of the fever, wringing cool water over his brow, and on the second night, when the fever broke and his pale eyes came clear and found her in the lamplight, he lay a long while just looking at her, as though checking she was real. His hand moved across the blanket toward hers and stopped, uncertain, an inch away, 20 years of a lawman's iron caution seizing him even now. And she, who had crossed an ocean, who had stood on her own porch before 50 men, who had cut a bullet out of him with her father's blade. She was not going to be stopped by one poor inch. She closed it. She laid her hand over his and threaded her small brown fingers between his broad scarred ones, and this time no wagon rattled past, and this time neither of them let go. "Say your name," he said, low and cracked, "your whole name. I have called you nothing but ma'am for 2 years like a coward." "Lin Ah Ling," she told him. "In my village, they called me Ah Ling, Little Ling, the bell." She turned his big hand over in both of hers and traced the old scars on his palm. The rope burned faint and white across it. 20 years old, the one he had never once explained and did not need to. "And you are Cole. In my language, your kind of stubbornness has no polite word, only a rude one." The laugh that came out of him surprised them both. A rusty, broken thing that clearly had not been used in years, and it turned into a wince, and she pressed him gently down. But he kept her hand. He kept it all that night. And somewhere before dawn, with the red lantern of Chinatown throwing its faint warm color across the shop ceiling and the smell of her healing herbs thick around them, he said the thing, at last, that the whole hard country had told them both was forbidden. "I have got nothing to offer you," Cole Whitaker said into the dark, "but a dented star and a bad hip and a name half this town still won't say your name next to. I know what it costs a woman like you to be seen with a man like me. I have watched what it costs you every day for 2 years and said nothing, because I told myself standing near you was the most a man in my place could do." He drew a slow breath against the pain of the wound. "But I am done being a man who says nothing, so I will say it plain, and you can throw me out into the street with it if you want. I love you, Ah Ling. I have loved you since the morning you brought me tea on a broken porch like I was worth the courtesy. I would marry you tomorrow if the law allowed it and stand in front of every mob this territory can raise for the rest of my life, and count it the cheapest bargain I ever made." She was quiet so long that fear came into his eyes. She was quiet because in her whole life across 2 worlds, no one had ever offered her a thing without a price, and she was turning this one over in her hands like the jade at her throat, feeling for the flaw and finding none. When she finally spoke, it was in Cantonese first, softly, the way her mother had spoken to her father in the blue dark of the village house. "Sam Gon," she said. "My heart, my liver," the old endearment that meant the organs a person cannot live without. And then, so that he would understand, she said it again in his own plain English. "You are my heart," she told him, "and you already married me the night you turned your back on your gun and put yourself between me and all of them. Where I come from, that is the whole of the wedding. The rest is only paper." She lifted the little soapstone chop from where it lay beside the lamp, her father's honest name cut into the stone, and she pressed it once, firm, into the soft flesh of his good palm, leaving the faint red mark of it there like a seal on a contract older than any territory's law. "There, now you carry my father's name. He would have liked you, I think. He also could not keep his mouth shut when it mattered. The territory said they could not marry, and so for a while they did not. On paper. But Coldwater, which had nearly burned her, watched the sheriff move his few belongings down to the low end into the room behind the herb shop, and watched the China woman and the lawmen walk the crooked main street, side by side in the honest morning light, and found, to its own slow surprise, that the sky did not fall. Ambrose Doyle went down to Carson in irons, and then to the territorial prison for the murder of Tom Falk, and the silver ledge under Chinatown, when the assayers came, proved real. And by a quirk of the claim law and a fair-minded circuit judge, it was found to belong to the men who had lived above it all along, so that the 40 souls of the low end, who had nearly been driven into the desert, became, in a single season, the least poor Chinese in the state. Uncle Fong wept at that and said old Lin's ghost had arranged it. Ah Ling thought it was more likely the ghost of Tom Falk, who had died for the truth and been, in the end, believed. They were married in the spring, in the only way the law would allow them, and in every way it could not touch. The county clerk would not sign the paper, but the widow Abernathy opened her boarding-house parlor, and Doc Merrifield stood witness, and half the low end came in their best silks, and Ah Sing, no longer quite an orphan, for she and Cole had quietly taken him, carried the tea on a lacquered tray with his ears red as lanterns. She wore her mother's jade in her hair and a red silk shawl that Uncle Fong produced from some deep trunk of memory, and she poured tea for Cole's people, which were only the doctor and the widow and a reformed deputy or two, and Cole knelt in his ill-fitting good coat and drank it, and then together they burned 3 sticks of incense before a small ancestor tablet on which she had cut, with her father's knowing hands guiding hers from wherever he now was, 2 names side by side, Lin and Whitaker, in the same careful strokes. The exclusion came the next year, the law from back east that shut the ocean like a door and told her people they were no longer wanted on Gold Mountain, and it broke a great many hearts in the low end, and it did not break hers, because she had already made her belonging out of harder stuff than a nation's permission. She had made it out of a swept floor, and a bar dropped across a door, and a hand closed over a hand that would not let go. Let the law say what it liked. She had a red lantern at her door, and a big scarred man asleep behind her counter, and a boy learning his characters by lamplight, and the smell of 10,000 miles of her mother's kitchen in every jar on her shelf. She had crossed an ocean to bury her father, and had, instead, planted a whole life in the dust of a town that tried to burn her, and it had bloomed. Years on, for these things are best seen from years on, there was a good ranch out past the tannery flat, bought cheap when the mine went quiet, with a low log house and a garden where mint and lobach grew side by side, because she had planted them on purpose, and horses, and more children than she had once thought the West would ever let her keep. And on the porch of an evening the old sheriff, gray now and slow in the bad hip, would sit and watch the golden light come down over the prairie, and she would come out and put her small hand over his big scarred one where it rested on the rail, the rope burn gone almost to nothing, and neither of them would say very much, because they had said the one thing that mattered a long time ago, and everything since had only been the keeping of it. Once, near the end of a long good life, he lifted her hand and turned the little jade fish where it hung yet at her throat, the color of a river in a country he had never seen and had come, through her, to love. You were supposed to stay inside that night, he said, the way he had said it in the torchlight, the way he said it every year on the anniversary, their whole story folded into 6 worn words. And you, she answered, as she always answered, were supposed to keep your mouth shut. And the old man laughed his rusty laugh out over the darkening plains, and she leaned her head against his shoulder, and the red lantern by the door came alight as the boy she had raised carried a taper to it, warm against the coming night. I have wondered, telling you this by the fire, what it takes to stand straight when a whole town leans its weight against your one thin door, and whether courage like Ah Ling's is something we are born with, or something the hard country teaches us, one thrown stone at a time. If you had been on that porch in the torchlight, would you have run for the wash and the rail spur, or would you have unbarred your door and stepped out alone into the light? Tell me down in the comments. I read every one of them, and I would dearly love to know. And if this story of the only Chinese woman in Coldwater and the sheriff who would not hold his tongue warmed something in you the way that Red Lantern warmed the dark, do stay with me a while, subscribe, and come back to the fire, for there are a great many more of these frontier hearts waiting to have their stories told, and I would be so glad to tell you the next one.